You believe that the rules of engagement, even in the age of zero tolerance, still demand restraint. You believe that an act of war, sinking a vessel, is reserved for state-sponsored conflict. But what if a single executive order changed all the rules? What if the line between law enforcement and lethal military action vanished in a single terrifying blast? At September 14th, 2025, 11:45 p.m. Eastern Time, the location is 80 nautical miles north of Curaçao, in the dark international waters of the Caribbean Sea. The vessel, the San Miguel, a Venezuelan-flagged, unlit coastal freighter suspected of moving weapons and illicit narcotics. The actor, the USS Farragut, a powerful Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. President Trump's zero-tolerance order against state-sponsored smuggling has been in effect for 72 hours. At 11:46 p.m., Captain Elias Vance of the Farragut issues the command. What follows is not a warning shot, not a boarding, but a direct, targeted anti-ship missile strike. This is the story of the first vessel sunk under the new doctrine, a moment that instantly shattered decades of diplomatic norms. Today, we will break down the split-second decision, the global shockwaves that followed, and the terrifying moral precedent set by this new era of warfare. The world reacted within hours. The initial intel report confirms the doctrine of zero tolerance, an unprecedented order. Let's establish the context of this unprecedented act. The zero-tolerance executive order, signed just days before the sinking, wasn't merely a political statement. It was a radical revision of the U.S. military's Rules of Engagement, ROE. You must understand the fundamental shift. Under this new doctrine, any foreign-flagged vessel suspected of moving high-level illegal goods, weapons, or high-volume narcotics, and failing to comply with immediate maritime interdiction, could be classified as a hostile threat and targeted with lethal force. The order explicitly tied these smuggling operations back to destabilizing state actors. The order was met with political outrage in Washington, deemed unconstitutional by many legal scholars. But on September 14th, Captain Vance and the USS Farragut were the first to face the stark reality of enforcing it. The decision was no longer political. It was tactical, immediate, and final. This change in ROE essentially transformed the Caribbean Sea into a high-risk war zone overnight. The critical tactical assessment details the target, the San Miguel, and the deadly cargo. Let's look at the target, the San Miguel. She was not a warship. She was a rusted, aging Venezuelan coastal freighter, flying a legitimate flag, but intelligence painted a darker picture. The vessel had been tracked by U.S. intelligence for weeks, confirmed to be carrying a highly volatile cargo, advanced guidance components for older missile systems, financed by international narco-state alliances. The cargo, estimated at over $200 million, represented a direct threat to stability in the region. The time, 11:30 p.m. The Farragut illuminated the San Miguel and issued a clear four-language warning to stop for boarding. The captain of the San Miguel chose to accelerate and extinguish all running lights, confirming the hostile threat classification under the new ROE. The choice, for Captain Vance, was simple: obey the commander-in-chief's explicit order and neutralize the threat immediately, or risk the catastrophic consequences of letting the deadly cargo reach its destination. In the cockpit of the Farragut, the Harpoon anti-ship missile was armed, locked, and ready. The follow-up operational debriefing summarizes the sinking, 11:46 p.m., the sound of a doctrine. At 11:46 p.m., September 14th, 2025, the silence of the Caribbean was obliterated. The command was given, Fire 1. The Harpoon missile struck the San Miguel's engine room, immediately crippling the vessel and setting off secondary explosions from the volatile cargo. The impact was not merely physical, it was geopolitical. The action was swift, brutal, and left no doubt about the severity of the new policy. The sinking was confirmed just moments later by drone surveillance. Captain Vance immediately reported the incident up the chain of command, triggering a series of reactions that would ripple across the globe within hours. The justification was immediate. Vessel non-compliant. Hostile intent confirmed. Cargo neutralized. The cost was steep. While initial reports indicated no state military personnel on board, the sinking of a flagged vessel in international waters was a declaration of unilateral power with profound implications for maritime law. This single explosion was the sound of a new military political doctrine taking tangible, deadly form. The final strategic review concludes. Global shockwaves. The hour-by-hour reaction. Within the first hour of the sinking, 0:46 a.m., September 15th, the global intelligence and defense community was in uproar. News began to leak through military channels. Hour 1. Venezuela's fury. The Venezuelan government issued an immediate, blistering condemnation, calling the action an act of state terrorism and a violation of its sovereignty, demanding the immediate recall of the U.S. ambassador. Hour 3. The UN Security Council convenes. Russia and China immediately called for an emergency session, labeling the sinking a reckless disregard for international law and warning of dangerous military escalation in the Western Hemisphere. Hour 6. European division. European allies were sharply divided. NATO issued a statement expressing deep concern over the escalation of force, while Britain offered cautious support, acknowledging the severity of the smuggling threat. You must understand the gravity. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a diplomatic tsunami triggered by a premeditated military action. The sinking of the San Miguel was the first time in decades the U.S. explicitly used direct lethal force against a non-military, flagged vessel under a domestic executive order, creating a crisis of legality and legitimacy. The initial intel report confirms the moral cost, the sailors, and the human element. Now, we turn to the human cost. While the San Miguel was a military target, it was manned by human sailors. The time, 06:00 hours. Search and rescue efforts began amidst the wreckage. The Farragut's duty. Despite sinking the vessel, the USS Farragut immediately shifted to a search and rescue footing, deploying rescue boats and medical teams. This moral dissonance, the shift from killer to savior, was deeply felt by the crew. The sailor's burden. Many junior sailors, trained for years on the nuances of maritime interdiction, felt the shock. The emotional burden of firing an anti-ship missile at a small freighter, an action usually reserved for a major naval war, was immense. This internal struggle, the conflict between duty and conscience, is the real tragedy of zero tolerance. You see the tactical victory, but we see the moral scars. This is the unspoken sacrifice of the order, forcing good people to make lethal decisions under the most ambiguous of circumstances. The critical tactical assessment details. Escalation. The Caribbean becomes a war zone. The consequence of the sinking was instant escalation. September 16, 2025. Venezuela immediately announced military readiness drills along its coast and scrambled air patrols. Counter-smuggling. The sinking was intended to stop smuggling. In reality, it only drove the illegal operations deeper into the shadows, making them harder to track and more aggressive. Increased risk. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard patrols in the Caribbean now faced an exponentially increased threat. Every non-compliant vessel was now a potential war target, and every patrol was now a potential target for retaliation. This action didn't solve the problem. It transformed a policing action into a low-intensity maritime shadow war. The Caribbean, once a trade route, was now a geopolitical chessboard where any mistake could trigger a full-scale international conflict. The follow-up operational debriefing summarizes the final verdict: legality versus deterrence. Finally, we must consider the final verdict. The core conflict here is between legality and deterrence. The Trump Doctrine, the zero-tolerance order, prioritized immediate, decisive deterrence over protracted legal battles. The message was clear: risk your ship, risk your life, if you challenge the U.S. doctrine. The global response. The world overwhelmingly condemned the action on legal grounds, arguing it undermined the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Unclose. You may agree with the goal, stopping illegal trade and weapons proliferation, but you must reckon with the terrifying precedent set that a single nation, through an executive order, can unilaterally change the fundamental rules of the sea. The sinking of the San Miguel was not the end of a skirmish. It was the beginning of a new, unstable military political era. The world reacts within hours because the question is no longer if the U.S. will use this power, but who will be the next target. The final strategic review concludes. The Admiral's Nightmare. The price of precedent. The scene shifts to the Pentagon. September 15th, 0900 hours. Admiral Hayes, commander of the U.S. Fleet Forces Command, faced the media and his own inner conflict. He was a career officer, a man of rules and procedure, now tasked with defending an order that shredded maritime precedent. The defense. The official line was robust. The vessel, the San Miguel, had demonstrated hostile intent by non-compliance and posed an immediate, existential threat due to its cargo. The sinking was an act of self-defense under the new, necessary doctrine. The unspoken fear. Admiral Hayes's real fear was not the political fallout, but the strategic domino effect. The sinking effectively gave carte blanche to every other major naval power, China, Russia, Iran, to apply their own zero-tolerance rules against vessels they deemed hostile in international waters. The oceans were suddenly less safe, governed by might, not law. The public divide. American public opinion was sharply split. A fast-moving poll showed a narrow majority favoring the decisive action against smugglers, viewing it as a strong sign of leadership. Yet, a significant minority condemned the unilateral violence, fearing the U.S. was sacrificing its moral high ground. You feel the pull of both sides, the desire for decisive action and the profound need for stability and law. The Farragut's missile created a chasm in the American soul. The initial intel report confirms. The White House War Room, a calculated risk. Inside the White House Situation Room, 1300 hours, September 15th, the president and his advisors were managing the global crisis they had intentionally provoked. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated risk, designed to shock adversaries into compliance. The architect of chaos. The president's national security advisor argued the move was brilliant, a demonstration that the U.S. was finally serious about national security threats emanating from narco-states. The world respects power, not procedure, was the core philosophy. The diplomatic cost, the Secretary of State, however, was visibly strained, reporting an immediate freeze on several crucial trade negotiations and the withdrawal of ambassadors from 2 Latin American nations. The political cost was escalating rapidly. The intelligence loop. While the Farragut was busy with the initial strike, sophisticated Global Hawk reconnaissance drones were activated over the Caribbean, flying 24/7 surveillance missions. The threat had intensified, and the zero-tolerance policy required perfect intelligence to avoid repeating the sinking with a purely civilian vessel, a catastrophic scenario the White House could not afford. The sinking was a tactical success against one ship, but it initiated a long-term, resource-intensive escalation that demanded constant vigilance and perfect execution. The critical tactical assessment details. The reactionaries. China's and Russia's immediate play. The global reaction was swift and predictable from the 2 major adversaries. China and Russia did not merely condemn the act. They exploited it. China's maritime doctrine. China immediately used the incident to justify its own aggressive posturing in the South China Sea. State media ran continuous reports labeling the U.S. as a lawless maritime hegemon, claiming the sinking proved the necessity of their own Type 055 destroyers and coastal defense missiles. They subtly suggested that similar hostile actions near their waters would be met with equivalent, lethal force. Russia's diplomatic offensive. Russia launched a full-scale diplomatic offensive at the UN, demanding an international, legally binding convention to limit the use of force in international waters, painting the U.S. as the primary threat to global peace. Simultaneously, Russian naval vessels were detected moving into the Caribbean for humanitarian and relief exercises, a clear show of force in the American backyard. You see the immediate danger. The zero-tolerance order provided the perfect casus belli, a pretext for escalation, for other nations to advance their own aggressive agendas under the guise of national defense. The sinking achieved its immediate goal, but it made the world exponentially more dangerous. The follow-up operational debriefing summarizes the sailors' silence, duty, trauma, and the new Navy. Let's return to the USS Farragut, now limping toward Puerto Rico. The time is September 17th. The crew has had 48 hours to process the action. There is a palpable silence on board. Processing trauma. Sailors who had never seen combat were now involved in the destruction of a vessel and the immediate aftermath of sinking. The ship's chaplain was working overtime, providing counsel for sailors struggling with the sudden, lethal nature of their duty. The new normal. The reality on the Farragut was that the ROE had changed forever. Future interactions would be marked by an intense, nervous tension. Every radar contact, every non-compliant vessel, would carry the implicit threat of missile launch. This is the heavy cost of deterrence, the psychological burden on the forces implementing it. Technical readiness. The engineering teams scrambled to restore full combat readiness, knowing that a single retaliatory strike, perhaps by a submarine or a rogue coastal defense unit, could finish them off. The entire ship was a tense coil of exhaustion and hypervigilance. This new normal is what the zero-tolerance order purchased, a shift from predictable policing to instantaneous warfare. The final strategic review concludes. The economic fallout, trade routes, and insurance chaos. The impact of the sinking was immediately felt in the global economy, specifically in the maritime insurance and global shipping sectors. Insurance spike. Global marine insurance rates immediately spiked by over 30% for vessels operating near the Caribbean and other contested international waters. The insurance market recognized that the political risk of traveling through these corridors had become extreme. Trade route diversions. Major shipping companies began diverting cargo away from the Caribbean Sea, opting for longer, costlier routes around South America, adding days to transit times. This immediate self-policing by the global shipping community was a direct response to the heightened risk of military engagement. The economic weapon. The president's order had inadvertently become an economic weapon against global trade stability. The uncertainty of the new ROE created a massive, tangible economic slowdown. The action designed to stabilize the region created instability in the global supply chain. This demonstrates that modern military action, even against a small vessel, has instant, disproportionate economic consequences. The initial intel report confirms. The American paradox, power versus morality. The core legacy of the San Miguel sinking is the American paradox, the struggle between maintaining global military dominance and upholding the moral authority that gives that power legitimacy. The power argument. Supporters argued the U.S. had finally shed the self-imposed legal handcuffs that allowed rogue states to exploit international waters. Power must be used decisively to be effective. The moral erosion. Critics argued that by abandoning UNCLOS and international maritime law, the U.S. was acting as a rogue power, setting a precedent that would ultimately destabilize the world far more than any narco-smuggling operation. The U.S. sacrificed its unique position as the upholder of the rule of law. You must weigh the options. Is a safer world one governed by clear, if brutal, deterrence, or one governed by consensus and international treaties, even if they are slow and often ineffective? The zero-tolerance order was a test of American character, revealing a nation willing to trade some of its moral authority for a perceived gain in immediate security. The critical tactical assessment details. The final lesson. The new rules of engagement. The final lesson from the San Miguel is clear. The rules of engagement have permanently changed. Rule 1. Salvo mass over single ship. No single high-tech warship, regardless of its Aegis system, is safe from a multi-vector, overwhelming swarm attack. Rule 2. Political risk is now tactical risk. Military assets are now deployed as immediate, lethal extensions of executive political policy. The decision to fire is as much political as it is tactical. Rule 3. Deterrence by certainty. The threat is no longer about what the U.S. might do, but what it will do. The certainty of immediate, lethal retaliation is the new basis of deterrence. Your life lessons are the same. Are you being decisive in dealing with your most threatening problems? Or are you hoping procedural patience will prevail? The sinking of the San Miguel is a harsh reminder. When faced with a threat to your stability, sometimes the only option is immediate, uncompromising action. The Farragut eventually returned to port, its victory overshadowed by the global political firestorm it ignited. The zero-tolerance order remained in effect. The sea was quieter, but the world was louder. The sinking of a single ship in the Caribbean transformed the entire global risk matrix in less than 24 hours. The political reaction was instantaneous. The military consequences, long-lasting. If you are facing a threat to your future, remember the resolve of the Farragut's captain. You have the power to draw your own line in the sand. Challenge. What is the rule you have been following that is now holding you back? Share your thoughts on the most dangerous precedent set by this sinking. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because next week, we break down the 5 greatest risks of this new maritime war zone and how they affect your investments.